Hey everybody, welcome back to our second video for section 4.1, where we are continuing to look at the basics of hypothesis testing. So what we looked at in the last video was just building the hypothesis out of words into our math symbols. If they're talking about an average, a mean, that's our mu. If they're talking about a proportion or a percentage, that's our p for the population. Now, ultimately, what I'm trying to do is test some sort of a claim. Now, we saw that I used that claim to build two hypotheses. The claim could be either one. However, it's the null hypothesis that I'm focusing on to test. And there's two things I can do. I can either reject that null hypothesis, meaning I throw it out, or I can fail to reject. Oh, that got a little sloppy. Let me fix that. If I fail to reject, what that basically means is I have to keep it. I can't throw it out. There's not enough evidence. Now, this has nothing to do with whether or not that hypothesis is true. If you reject a true hypothesis, that is what we call a type 1 error. When I reject, but it was true. What that means is it was a true claim, or a true hypothesis, I should say, but we threw it out. Then that was a mistake. I should have kept it. It was true. I should have failed to reject. The reverse of it can also be true. If I fail to reject, meaning I keep something, but it was really false, so I keep, aka fail to reject, but it was false, then that is what we call a type 2 error. It was a false hypothesis, but I kept it. So in this video, we are going to explore this a little bit more. A student needs to schedule for a composition class next semester, but isn't sure whether he'll pass. Well, there's basically two hypotheses. The null hypothesis, the student passes, he's successful. The alternative, he does not pass, he's not successful. This is the one that I'm testing. A type 1 error says it is, I reject, but true. If I reject it, then I believe the student did not pass. That is what I believe. I throw it out. I said he did not actually pass. But in reality, the student did. So what ends up happening as a result, I rescheduled Comp 1 for next semester, when in reality, the student should have moved on. A type 2 error goes the other direction. That is when I fail to reject. I keep it, but in reality, it was false. So this type of error says, hey, I'm going to keep it. I'm going to believe that the student passed the class, but in reality, the student failed. What happens as a result now is I allow the student to move on, but he should have stayed in the class. He should have retaken it. So if I think about it in terms of this statistics course, a type 1 error says, we don't believe the student's going to pass, so we sign them up to take this class again next semester. In reality, the student passes, they should have been able to move on. Type 2 error flip-flops that. We believe student's going to pass, let's schedule them for the next class. But in reality, the student fails, and we should have forced them to retake it. Either way, they end up with the wrong schedule. Either way, they end up with the wrong schedule. If the student is going to fail, they should retake the class. If the student's going to pass, they should not. They should be able to move on. If we make one of these errors, we end up with the wrong schedule for the next semester. So let's see if we can do this in a new scenario. The USDA limit for salmonella contamination for ground beef is 7.5%. They are giving you a proportion of salmonella for beef. A meat inspector reports that the ground beef produced by a company exceeds the USDA limit. This is the claim. You perform a hypothesis test to determine whether the meat inspector's claim is true. So I can't start talking about these errors until I build the hypothesis. That way I know what I'm actually testing. So because this is based on a proportion, I have two hypotheses for P. The claim is that the contamination exceeds the limit. So we believe that the proportion is greater than 7.5%. That is the alternative hypothesis because exceeds means strictly bigger. The null then would just flip the sign. The null says my proportion is less than or equal to 0.075. I'm going to do this for us using the percentage so that we can talk about it that way. But please note that if we were doing this for real, it would have to be in decimal form. So my null hypothesis, HO, is that my proportion is less than or equal to 7.5%. And there are two types of errors that we can make. A type 1 is when I reject the null, but it was true. If I'm going to reject the null, what I'm saying is that I believe that we were the alternative. I believe we had more than 7.5% of salmonella. That's scary, right? We believe there's more than that. But in reality, my null was true. So in reality, there was less than or equal 77.5% salmonella. So basically what happens here, because of what I believe, I cause a big scare. I scare everybody saying, oh no, this beef is contaminated. Throw it out. Beef prices plummet. It's a bad deal. I cause it based off of what I believe. I rejected the null. I said, nope, this one was wrong. I should have gone with the alternative. I say I believe there was more than 7.5% salmonella. I cause a big scare, when in reality, the beef was safe. Now, I caused a big scare, but thankfully, anybody who ate the beef is fine because I was within the legal limits. That's what we call a type 1 error. I reject, but in reality, it was true. Let's now go the other direction. The other direction, the type 2 error, is when I do not reject, aka I keep this null hypothesis. I say, you know what? I believe it. I believe we have less than 7.5% salmonella. In other words, I claim, or I believe I should say, it is safe. However, that was an error. I believe it's safe, but in reality, it was a false claim. In reality, the other one was true. In reality, there was more than 7.5% salmonella. That means I've told everybody it was safe, but in reality, it should have been thrown out. This is the worst error. This one is more serious in this situation because I told everybody it was safe, but the food makes everyone sick. These errors are not the easiest to wrap their minds around. While it's not currently in your formula sheet, you are welcome to write out which type is which. So the way I try to remember it, type 1 is when it's a rejection, I throw it out, but it's true, I should have kept. Type 2 error is when I keep that null hypothesis, but in reality, I should have thrown it out. This is just going to take practice. So I'm going to stop this video here. All we've gotten through was one example, but it's because errors can be a lot to talk about. When we come back, we're going to finish up our conversation looking at the process of the hypothesis test. We'll actually perform them in our next lesson.